Hello everyone, my name is Mike Curley and I'm the Mayor of the City of Burnaby. Before we start, I would like to take a moment to recognize that I am on the ancestral and unceded homelands of the Hunkaminam and Squamish speaking people, and to extend appreciation to be part of a meeting on this territory. Welcome everyone to this important event about climate change in British Columbia on World Environment Day 2022. Regretfully, my schedule did not allow me to attend today's event, but I am very honored to have the opportunity to share a brief greeting with you all. It's no secret that climate change is already having an effect on our lives as British Columbians. Communities across this province have had to deal with seasonal flooding, forest fires, and intense weather events. And all of these events are made worse by the effects of climate change. Extreme weather can be frightening, and the scale of climate change can make the solution seem out of reach for the average person. It's true, we won't solve climate change overnight, but together we can make a difference and set our communities on a path towards carbon neutrality. And we can take steps to help protect our family, friends, and neighbors from extreme weather events. By being here today and taking part in this online conference, you are all taking a very important step towards protecting this province and your community. I want to take a moment to thank the Foundation for a Plan Forward for helping to organize today's event, and for inviting me to share this video greeting with all of you. I encourage you to take what you learned today and share it with your communities. Together we can build a brighter future while protecting the vulnerable people of our province. Thank you.
My name is Rabbi Philip Bregman, and I am the Interfaith Liaison for the Jewish Federation of Greater Vancouver. And I'm here today through this tape because today, this Sunday, is actually a Jewish festival. And so I have pre-taped this message to talk for a few moments about the importance of the environment and climate change and nature in its relation to Judaism. Right from the very beginning of our Holy Scriptures, in the opening verses and chapters of the Torah, we hear about the creation of nature and how incredibly important it is, and that there is a relationship between nature and humans. We are responsible for what happens on this planet. We are responsible. We're responsible not only for each other as human beings, we're not only responsible for all living creatures, but this also includes nature itself. In fact, Judaism has a special day in the year, a holy day called Tu B'Shvat. It is the birthday of the trees. Why would we have a birthday for the trees? Well, our tradition talks about giving the crops away to those who are disadvantaged in life, and that you have to give a certain portion of your crops away, 10%. Well, in order to figure out what the 10% is, we need to have 10% from when? From the beginning of this Rosh Hashanah Le'ilanot, the New Year of the Trees, until the following year. You calculate it on that basis. Judaism has always been concerned about the very nature of where we live and how we live. We, like Islam, perhaps are the very first to have what we would call today green funerals. Funerals in which there is no metal that is put into the ground. And what is put into the ground has to be biodegradable. This goes back for both of our traditions, Islam and Judaism, for centuries and centuries. We do not embalm individuals. We do not want to put anything artificial into the body, but we believe in the natural disintegration of dust to dust and going back in there. We are incredibly grateful to the firefighters and all that they did this past year risking their lives in the most incredible fashion of these forest fires as a result of climatic change, and then to be followed by incredible flooding. We are also very grateful for the Sikh community and how they mobilized in getting food into communities and renting helicopters. And we did our part by contributing financially to assist the Sikh community in providing for food and clothing and helping to pay for some of those helicopters as well. We are all responsible for the phenomenal gifts that God has given us. And if we decide to play fast and loose, as it appears that we are, there will not be a world. There will not be nature. We will have done our part, not in preserving it, but in helping to destroy it. I pray that all of us this day may not simply talk the talk, but walk the talk. Thank you, and God bless.
So Assalamu alaikum, peace and blessings be with you. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm calling in today from the Mississauga of the Credit Territories here in Toronto, Ontario, and Foundation for a Path Forward is based in the lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. When thinking about issues of truth and reconciliation, one of the learnings that we encountered very recently was how much of Indigenous land has been taken and what they think of as options for reconciliation, particularly in terms of Crown land. The suggestions brought forth by Indigenous communities are ones that we have to both respect, understand, and work towards coming to solutions about how we see our lived experience on Turtle Island or Canada going forward together. I'd like to thank them for the work they've done in preserving and improving the land for nearly 10,000 years, including as it relates to today's topic, which is environmental sustainability and protection against fires and flooding. For those who might not be aware, today is World Environment Day. Today's event focuses on the building of a multicultural awareness for best practices, preparedness, and planning for the upcoming year, as well as future years regarding floods and fires here in British Columbia. I'd like to start by thanking a few of the folks on the call. Hassan Ghani, thank you from Islamic Relief for the idea of the humanitarian coalition to share information, best practices, and support among NGOs in BC, as well as our co-organizer today, Upkar Singh Tetlia, the Executive Director of Engaged Communities Canada Society, for having the intention to bring IBOC communities and firefighters together in awareness building and preparedness. Over the past 5 decades, millions of people have taken part in World Environment Day's events. Each World Environment Day focuses on a particular theme, such as covering issues like maritime pollution, global warming, sustainable consumption, or wildlife poaching. For this World Environment Day, we're here to build awareness of the work multi-faith and multicultural NGOs are doing to address extreme weather events, as well as the best practices and lived experiences from firefighters and other first responders in dealing with them. The summer wildfires and fall flooding, both of which claimed many lives here in British Columbia, are among the world's most destructive climate catastrophes last year. In 2021, as many of us are very aware, the wildfire season in British Columbia destroyed over 1,600, with 1,600 fires, destroyed over 8,700 square kilometers of land. The Litton Creek wildfire, which destroyed the community of Litton and killed 2 people, was one of the most destructive of that. This was followed by November flooding, where storms and atmospheric rivers drenched the province with water that caused massive destruction to crops, livestock, and family across British Columbia. Our vision for this event is to really help the formation of a humanitarian coalition to coordinate aid and support amongst NGOs in these emergencies, to better share knowledge and resources to avoid redundancies and duplication of efforts, as well as unnecessary aid and material and donation, as well as to build awareness of Indigenous land-based practices, best practices for preparing and managing land, share lessons learned from last year and best practices going forward for this year, as well as increasing representation and inspiring IBOC community members who choose to join firefighting and first responding as a career and as a service to their community. I'd like to thank all of our speakers for joining and taking their time out on a beautiful Sunday to participate in this event for the well-being of our community and our current and future generations. I'd like to start by inviting MP Talib Noor Mohammed from Vancouver Granville and Chair of the Federal Liberal Pacific Caucus. MP Noor Mohammed is part of the Standing Committee of Public Safety and National Security and the Standing Joint Committee for Scrutiny of Regulations. Talib earned his Bachelor of Arts from Princeton University, a Master's in International Education Policy from Harvard, and then attended Oxford for his doctoral studies. Talib is also a recipient of the Governor General's Caring Canadian Award and the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal. Talib, thank you for joining us tonight.
Thanks very much, Yusuf. It's always a pleasure to be with you and to see familiar and new faces. It's always great to see Nikki on these things as well. It's important for us to know that we work on these things not just as levels of government, but as a team. And I wanted to first of all start by expressing my gratitude to be able to represent Vancouver Granville, which is of course located on the traditional unceded territory of the Coast Salish First Peoples, the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh. And it's always an honor and a privilege to be able to live, work, and play and indeed represent this community in Ottawa. We talk a lot about what happened last year and the year before with forest fires. We talk about the floods that happened not long ago. And, I think there are so many important lessons for us. We heard from Rabbi Bregman the importance that the environment plays in Jewish culture. Look, as a Muslim, we are taught that we are stewards of this planet and that we are responsible to God for what we do to the planet while we are here. And so that's always been something that's been with me as I think about the types of things that we do as a government and types of things we do as individuals in order to be able to try and think about preparedness, think about long-term planning, thinking about how we care for the environment on this, World Environment Day. Really, every day should be World Environment Day in terms of how we think about our actions, our deeds, everything from something as simple as recycling and thinking about how we, can we walk versus getting into the car when we're trying to go somewhere, all the way through to the big policy decisions that we seek to make. And we talk about preparedness, and I think this is something that, we're spending a lot of time on today. And so I think back actually to just last week, we had Minister Blair, who was not able to join us today, at our Public Safety and National Security Committee. And I had the chance to ask Minister Blair a few questions. And one of the things that I asked about was, look, how prepared are we for the next event in British Columbia? How prepared are we for the next round of forest fires, the next rounds of floods? And in the conversation, he said something that I think is very important because it's something that I know all of us really care about. And that is, how do we learn from Indigenous communities? How do we learn about the ways in which Indigenous communities have taken care of the land, protected the land, and managed through all manner of environmental crises and challenges, from floods to fires, since the time before we got here and since then? And this is something that I think is really important, because when federal ministers, when the federal government, the provincial government, when municipalities are asking the questions of how do we learn from Indigenous knowledge, how do we take from Indigenous knowledge to address these issues alongside science, alongside technology that we have today, I think we really start to develop what are going to be solutions for the future. And solutions for the future come from really three things. One is a willingness to understand and appreciate that the problem isn't going away, and we're going to have to deal with it. We're going to have to deal with the existential issue, which is climate change, but we're going to have to deal with the immediate issue, which is the consequences of climate change today. And so the first is acknowledging that there is a problem that we need to deal with. And I think this is really important to point out, because there are those that continue to this day to say that climate change is not a real thing, that these are, structural anomalies that happen once in a while and we need to just be okay with it. It's not okay. It's not going away. It is a real problem. And the only way we abate and make it better is by taking bold action today in terms of the climate crisis for the future. But it also means that we have to put stakes in the ground today to prepare for things that are inevitable in the short term. So the first, I think, is acknowledging. The second is, I think, moving to a team approach to try and address today's challenge, which is how do we ensure that we are prepared and ready for what comes next? Because there are going to be forest fires, whether we like them or not. There are going to be floods, whether we like it or not, until we deal with the existential issue. So in the meanwhile, I use this word team approach. We have had at the federal level a fantastic working relationship with Emergency Management BC. It's a fantastic, talented group of people that are working hard to address these issues. We've built great relationships across levels of government with Indigenous communities to try and address the very real issues that we're going to be dealing with this summer, next summer, and the summer after that. And I think the idea that nobody owns the solution and that everybody owns the problem, I think, is a really important way to approach things. Because if we start to look at the multifaceted things that are required to prepare for emergencies and natural disasters, as we deal with the big existential issue, I think we all come to realize we all have a role to play in this. How we think about things in our families, in our homes, how we think about things in our communities, whether they're religious communities or cultural communities, how we think about this as levels of government, and how it stops from passing the buck to saying, actually, this is something that we are all in together. And the very existence of our communities depend on our ability to find solutions together across levels of government and across communities. And I think the third is being willing to take decisive, immediate, bold, and sometimes difficult action. Those of us on this that are politicians, that's me and Nikki, really. Often politicians are accused of not wanting to make unpopular decisions, making hard decisions, because hard decisions are by their nature hard. Because we don't want to offend, we don't want to upset, we don't want to upset the base of voters. And I think this is one of those areas where not taking bold action, not taking big steps, not partnering with others is in fact going to be, at the end of the day, the absolute wrong thing to do. And so I think this is where being audacious in the way in which we approach managing, preparing, and frankly, dealing with disasters as they come is going to be the only way, in my view, that we actually manage our way out of these challenges. So what do I mean by that? And I'm going to try and be brief because I have a lot to say about this. The first is, I think, look, the federal government has made substantial investments. I mean, $500 million plus of money. The provinces put money in. Everyone is investing time, effort, and energy into this to make sure that supply chains remain intact, because we see what happens when supply chains go down. Flood happened, supply chain broke. Lots of terrible things happened across the country. Forest fires devastated communities. You saw what happened in Litton. Litton is effectively gone. I mean, these are real challenges. And so working across levels of government to put those investments to good use so that we're not just rebuilding for today, but building resilient infrastructure for tomorrow. I think that is something that we really need to look at and accept as the way of the future. The way that we build today, the way that we organize ourselves today will not work for the challenge that we're dealing with for tomorrow. So our ability to be adaptive, to use new technology, to learn from Indigenous knowledge, to put into place solutions that will actually withstand the challenges we're dealing with today, that's going to be important. And that's going to take work on everybody's part. It's going to take sacrifice on everybody's part. The other is changing behavior, how we actually think about where we go, how we travel, what we do, how we respond. These are going to be important things that we have to deal with. And so investments in fire safety, fire suppression, investments in building code changes, all of these things are short-term and immediate things that we have to lean into together. But I also want to take a minute to talk about the importance of the long term. We can prepare all we want, and we need to prepare, we need to be ready, and we need to work through all of these different challenges that we have in order to be ready for what is going to come. But the big opportunity for us, and because it's Environment Day today, I want to make this point. The opportunity for us is to ask the question, how do we deal with the big issue for the long term? How do we deal with the climate crisis that we are in today, so that 15, 20 years from now, the discussions we are having are hopefully somewhat different? And that is, again, something that I think is really going to require this idea of a collective human approach. Governments are not going to solve this problem on their own. Governments play a big role, but Indigenous leaders, the business community, ethnic communities, religious communities, average citizens, families, all of us have a role to play in how we actually take this on. And governments can lead by making good public policy. And we, provincial governments, others are going to be making and continue to make important decisions that help us down that path. But this is going to require a much broader approach in order for us to be able to address the very long-term challenge of climate change so that our kids and our grandkids actually have a planet that is inhabitable. And I raise this because I think it is often all too easy. It is often all too easy for us to say, you know, this is the federal government's problem, or it's the province's problem, or it's, you know, it's the private sector's problem. And it's not. It is actually everybody's problem. And I repeat this point because it is much easier. It is much easier to say, look, province X did this, the federal government did this community didn't do that, or, you know, that country over there, whether it's China or India, or blame somebody else. But this is going to take all of us saying we have to have personal ownership and personal responsibility of this, of the actions that we undertake to protect and preserve this planet. And so my call, my request to everyone who is listening to this is to say, you know, ask the very simple question, what are the things that we can do in our own lives? Who can we talk to? How can we influence folks? What are the decisions that we are making on the daily that actually allow us to say that we are doing something meaningful in stopping climate change, so that the conversations that we're going to be having with our kids and grandkids are hopefully more optimistic than the ones that we're having today. And in order for us to do that, I think we all need to find ways to really be introspective about the areas in which we do have influence and impact, and realize that they are much wider than we might think. And so people say to me, you know, Talib, you're a member of parliament. Do you like it when people write you letters and hassle you about this, that, or the other? And my response is always yes, because if people are writing, if people are concerned, particularly about the environment, it means that they're going to do something. And our job is to turn that energy into action. And it means not assuming that you can flip a switch tomorrow and fix the problem tomorrow, but make intelligent long-term decisions. And I think when we look at what the federal government has been doing over the course of the last little while, you look at what, and I really commend the province of BC. You look at the decisions that the province of BC has been making under Premier Horgan. There is a very real, I think, team effort, at least in BC, to look at how we can make meaningful, thoughtful, long-term decisions. Anybody that tells you you can do X or Y tomorrow and solve the problem is lying to you. Anyone that tells you that we should pretend that there isn't a problem is lying to you. Somewhere in the middle is actually how you get to the outcome. There is a very real problem, but the solution is not something that you can flip on or off today, and it's not going to go away by pretending you don't have to do something. So I think we have to take this intelligent, intelligent, moderate, thoughtful approach, but one that is also ambitious and aggressive, right? Ambitious and aggressive action on climate change does not require you to stop the world today. It requires you to take the actions that allow you to have solutions that are sustainable and long-term. And so my request is that all of us really take the time, the effort, and energy to realize that there is a very immediate, urgent crisis on our hands that requires immediate and urgent action, but those and that those actions need to be ones that are not just for today, but for the long term. So with that, I will turn it back to Yusuf, and I'd say thank you again for everyone for being part of this important conversation, and thank you to Foundation for a Path Forward for doing such a wonderful job of bringing us together across communities, always in having these important dialogues.
Thank you, Talib, for your inspiring and passionate contribution to the conversation. I know that, you know, recently you had a son, and in essence, the work that we're all doing here is to make a better world for him and all the children for the future, because it really is that urgent. We do have to insist upon a better world. Again, thank you. There is one thing that I think maybe Talib, the government has done that's awesome, is on April 7th, it allocated $37.9 million in the 2022 federal budget for wildland firefighting, which will help fulfilled the pledge of training an additional 1,000 firefighters here in Canada. So I thought it's important to mention that. Today's event, though, is not only about the solutions our elected representatives are working hard on, but also the efforts of NGOs in building the resilient infrastructure that Talib mentioned. At the intersection of those two is actually our next speaker. MLA Nikki Sharma is the Deputy Caucus Chair and Parliamentary Secretary for Community Development and Nonprofits in British Columbia. She was elected MLA for Vancouver Hastings in 2020 and is the Deputy Caucus Chair for the NDP government in British Columbia. She's also a member of the Treasury Board, and she was elected previously to the board of Vancity Credit Union, where she served as vice chair and chaired the Climate Justice Working Group. She also served as chair of the Vancouver Board of Parks and Recreation. Thank you so much, Nikki, for being with us tonight.
It's just so great to be here. Thank you, Yusuf, for that introduction. And Talib, congratulations on the baby. I didn't know that news, but that certainly is very great news. It's such a pleasure to be celebrating World Environment Day with all of you online. I also want to bring greetings from Mike Farnworth, who BC's Minister of Public Safety and Solicitor General, and Jen Rice, BC's Parliamentary Secretary for Emergency Preparedness. I'm coming to you from the traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people, and I think every day about that and how I can integrate real reconciliation to the work I do. A special thank you to Tarek and Yusuf from a Foundation for a Path Forward. I swear I never know where you're going to be calling in from, and Yusuf, apparently you're in Toronto this time, but every time we've had meetings, I've just been so impressed about how you're able to bring people together in very unique and different ways. And today is definitely an example of that. So my hands are always up to you and the work that you're doing. In 2020, I was sworn in as the first Parliamentary Secretary for Community Development and Nonprofits. And this role is one of the first of its kind in Canada, and it shows that BC, the government really shows the importance of and understands the importance of the nonprofit sector and all the work that it's doing. And my mandate is first and foremost to be the advocate for the sector within government, so we can understand the needs of it and help to understand how we can be good partners to the nonprofit sector. That's why this meeting and this topic is just so crucial. And actually, I heard about it through one of my meetings with Tarek and Yusuf about this specific topic, and I just think it's so timely and important. I want to talk a little bit about the nonprofit sector because I like to brag about it. You are all part of that in one way or another with the different organizations that you're a part of. The BC nonprofit sector contributes $6.7 billion to the provincial economy, and that's often something that a lot of people in the sector don't acknowledge or think about because they're so busy doing the things in their community that are so important. It also employs 86,000 British Columbians, and there are approximately 29,000 nonprofits across the province. And not only do they play a huge role in our everyday life, especially when we're during times of crises, and we've certainly seen that over the climate crises that this province has faced over the last couple of years. I just want to say that I meet with nonprofits and community leaders across the province, and I get to hear the work that they're doing. And what's really struck me is leadership that so many organizations showed during the climate crises when they were responding to the needs of the community. And I have to say, it gives me so much hope. I see some of the faces on the screen that are, part of this conversation, that are part of those people that are showing up for their communities. And I just want to talk a little bit about the importance of these nonprofits in emergency community response. We talked a little bit, we have been talking about how we are now at a time where we know we're going to face more climate crises in the future. And we know that we have to be prepared for those in new ways and to try to all leverage our resources to work together to respond. We talked about the tragedies of the wildfires and what happened in Litton and all the lives that were lost during the heat wave. And these are things that, we all as a province reeled from. And we learned a lot, I think, about what was happening in our communities and who showed up. And there's too many for me to list of all the organizations that I know showed up during some of our crises. And I know some of them are here, like the Islamic Relief Fund. And I heard about the work that was happening in First Nations communities during the fund, Khalsa Aid, which is also here, and the amazing work they did to deliver emergency food and all those things across the province. The First Nations Emergency Management Society, which was on the front line of a lot of devastating impacts, but showed up for communities. These are all examples that are really amazing and inspiring, but also what I'm so happy about with this conversation that we're having today is the way that it's focused on what we can learn from what all the nonprofits that showed up for community, what they experienced. And this idea that I think I've been hearing from a few organizations that I've met with about how do we know when we can get involved, how we can get involved, how do we coordinate our responses and our energy and our resources? What did we learn from the impacts of all of the climate crises that we faced, so we can help make the process and the system better, and that government can work together with nonprofits and communities. And faith-based nonprofits were definitely up there in terms of how they responded to communities. I want you to know that as a province, we are looking very specifically at our emergency response with exactly those questions in mind. What did we learn? How can we figure out how we can start responding to these climate crises that are going to happen more often? So we are modernizing our emergency program act that will focus on disaster risk reduction, emergency preparedness, recovery, climate adaptation. And that act, unfortunately, was introduced more than 2 decades ago, and it really hasn't kept up to the emergency management approaches that we need in today's day and age. We're looking to introduce that new legislation this fall. And there certainly will be opportunities, and I will take some of the lessons and feedback that we hear from today to think about the whole system that we have to build up in BC. I want to talk a little bit about just ongoing preparedness for this upcoming wildfire and flood season that we have, that is upon us. Emergency Management BC is hosting seasonal readiness sessions in each of the regions throughout the spring. And First Nations and local authorities in the region will be invited to attend, and we get to receive updates on environmental conditions and readiness actions. We're also providing local governments and 14 First Nations with community emergency preparedness funding to develop emergency evacuation route plans, and some projects that will help communities prepare better for the climate crisis coming up. But certainly feedback from what we're going to be talking about today is something I'm very keen to hear, particularly with my role, which is how do we as a government make sure that we're good partners with nonprofits that are out there in the communities that are doing all of the work. I want to just close my 5 minutes on something that I think is just so key to all the work that you do, and that's community resilience. And community resilience is a measure of a community to respond, to withstand, and to recover from crises. And this doesn't happen overnight. It's built up through the steady hands of many over time. And nonprofit organizations in this province serve so many community needs every day, and they help build up our resilience. So your work is quietly weaving the fabric of society in our communities, and we know we rely upon this during times of need. And I know that we'll have many challenges ahead from the impacts of climate change. And I know we're all thinking about that particularly today, but I want you to also know that you give me hope, and that all the community leaders that I meet that are working to make this better also give me hope. And you remind everybody that we're in this together, and that together we can build a society that can face these challenges, one that is compassionate, inclusive, and sustainable. I just want to thank you so much for having me here today, and I look forward to the outcomes of the discussion.
Thank you so much, Nikki. You know, the passion and experience you bring to these calls and these issues, it's always a pleasure because I always learn something new. And I wanted to say that the definition with the importance of resilience being woven together with the community organizations, in addition to government, in addition to faith-based organizations, is one that I think a lot of people might not totally understand unless they need it. And then when they need it, they get it. So the importance of having very strong nonprofit, non-government organizations is key to the development of many things, not only just a resilient society, but also a multicultural society, community-based organizations. Those develop strong. Like one of the biggest threats facing our communities is loneliness, actually. That's another topic, but the community organizations that support and facilitate addressing that are, again, saving lives in many, many ways. So thank you for your work in supporting the organizations that do that. It's very much appreciated and needed. Thank you, Nikki. Our next speaker, it takes the concept of service to the level of putting their own life on the line. Chris Bocock is the Burnaby Fire Chief. He is a subject matter expert in fire preparedness and responsiveness. Back since 1911, the Burnaby Fire Department has been providing professional, effective fire-related emergency services to save lives and property and environment. They have been working to train and support men and women in many service areas, including fire suppression, prevention, investigation, inspection, training, medical evacuation, and all the techniques needed to maintain safety and security and related to that field. Thank you so much for joining us, Chris. We have a few questions to go into, but before that, is there anything maybe you'd like to start with?
Well, I'd really like to express my gratitude for being included. What I can see and hear from all the people here is, the overarching thought of collectivism, of bringing the communities together to solving big problems through our collective strength. So I appreciate being involved. Foundations for a plan forward is definitely an organization I appreciate the leadership that they show in taking on these problems, because as we understand, these problems in our world are large and they scare a lot of people. And our leadership, or your leadership that you're showing and saying, this is all right, we can handle this, but we're all in this together and we all need to come up with solutions and be a part of that. So I thank you for being included, and I'm happy to kind of provide any detail around the wildfire experiences as I know it, from a response and from a preparedness side.
Well, you hit the nail on the head, and supporting each other and working together for the collective well-being. So like the impetus behind this was through Upkar Singh and the Engaged Communities Canada Society, the idea that we as IBOC community members have to have better awareness and understanding, as well as try and support our firefighters in a more visible manner, and how we work with one another was an idea from Hassan Ghani from Islamic Relief to have a humanitarian coalition of how to better support and understand each other, not to step on each other's toes, but to ensure that, hey, we at least know what everyone else is doing. And as we heard from Talib and as we heard from Nikki, there's so much that's being done, but to do it together with that shared vision, mission, and purpose is something that's super important in order to help prevent any kind of redundancies and help to accelerate the well-being of our communities in these challenging times. On that note, and as you were saying, with your many years of experience and considering the ongoing impacts of climate change, how would you say that you've seen the fire and flood seasons evolve over the last few decades here in British Columbia?
I've been in the fire service since 1994, so coming up on 30 years. My joints and my knees from the days of actually doing the work, they remind me of it daily. But some really good statistics. I believe it was 2003 when the Kelowna Fires, the fires that hit the central Okanagan area of Kelowna, were a very significant provincial emergency. And then we had a bit of a gap. We had some significant forest fires, and we've had those, but we never really got, it took up until about 2017 in the Elephant Hill that year. There was significant complex fires around the province. So that's about 14 years later. There's definitely a quickening piece to the significance of these events. 14 years between the significant provincial emergencies related to forest fires, and then Last year, we were right back to it after only a very short break of 3 to 4 years. So the concern is the rapid increase in frequency and how much we're seeing this. And I was a young man who grew up in Squamish, which is a small logging, very industrial community between Vancouver and Whistler. And I had the opportunity to speak to a colleague of mine who was first on scene of a forest fire there in the early months of May in an area that I grew up in. And he was talking about how quickly the fire spread. From someone who spent all of his time in the woods, enjoying nature, I couldn't believe there was a forest fire in that area in that time of the year, because you used to sink into the ground 2 or 3 inches because of how much moisture was in the ground in those rainforested areas. And what he described to me was something extremely foreign for someone who spent a lot of time there. So this is becoming a reality. It's becoming a reality of impact. And it's sad to say that we have to feel the negative consequences of impact before we decide to take on the challenges. Some of that's just natural humanity, but now we're faced with the reality. So, there's some definite things we can do to care for that. There's definite actions each of us can take, and then there's actions we can take from an organizational standpoint as well.
And some of those actions obviously require resources. And in your opinion, what types of material or support do you feel is needed to prepare successfully for this year? And what impact do you think that those resources would show?
So my experience, I've had 2 fairly significant command assignments outside of the city of Burnaby. One was in 2017 in the Elephant Hill, running nighttime fire operations, and one was I was the first responding chief officer at the request of the Office of the Fire Commissioner of BC to intervene into a fairly out of control situation in Litton last year. What if I was to answer your question? I really think it's multifaceted, but the ones that are going to jump out at me, I think we need better forefront organization on how we're going to respond. I think we're doing better at that as a province. But what I would say is where I've seen places and areas that have been very successful is what you're talking about. When we were doing the work that needed to be done, we were very reactive. We were caring for people. What we found in the communities, the Indigenous communities around Litton, is as we were trying to protect their homes, the extent they took to feed us and take care of us, it's that outward focus of trying to participate. In communities like Spence's Bridge, where the community opened its doors, whatever you need for us to help support the firefight in Litton. In the communities up and down up and down the valley south of Litton, they sent everything they had to the community of Litton. I think that's a really good premise in one way. It's a really good premise in that you've got to take care of your neighbor. You've got to be involved. In the heat wave, as an example, in the big cities, we were losing people to fatalities because they weren't checked on. And there's only limited ability for governments to go around and check on everybody. But for everybody who lives in a community, whether it's a community of faith or a smaller community, you can see strengths and opportunities where you take care of each other, right? Where you're better and more focused on checking in on people. Growing up in the small town that I grew up in, if there was a power outage, you would go door to door to make sure every one of your neighbors had everything they needed. Whether you were on good terms or not on good terms, there's always some natural conflict around people. But can you put it aside, and can you decide what you want to provide for each other in that time of crisis, knowing that it's affecting you, it's affecting them, and if it's affecting your community, it's affecting all of you. So we see some very good foundations, and to what you're talking about, whether it's an NGO, whether it's just a group of people deciding to care for each other, we can start to build that and create some structures to where the work becomes easier. Many hands makes light work. Any opportunity. And sometimes it's just being available. Hey, what can we do to help? It's all sorted out. Okay, here's my number, I'm available. Those are sometimes those acts of greatness, being ready and prepared happens forever. It's watching other people. It's seeing your neighbors, who's resilient and who's vulnerable, right? And understanding their stories as much as you can. Because if you take the time to understand people's stories, I think you'll start to understand a lot of things that contribute to either their vulnerability or their strength. There's lots of times where a vulnerable population can have strength past what other parts of the community have, and vice versa. We have many strengths that are weaknesses in some application, and vice versa. So I think understanding each other, building together, and trying to provide for each other as cross-secting communities is a key piece.
I really liked what you said about understanding our strengths and weaknesses, because as humans, as human-run organizations and governments, there's the strengths that we have where we excel at, and areas of improvement, which is a continuous thing. The Japanese term kaizen, right? Constant continuous improvement. On that note, we've seen many NGOs, including those on this call today, who contributed tremendous amounts of time, financing, aid to support both communities and firefighters in the field. Have you seen any areas where coordination or impact could have been improved? Or do you have any suggestions for those organizations this year and going forward?
I'm going to take the easiest part right off the top, and this isn't by far the most important piece of it. One of the challenges, we talk about this collectivism, and I mean, yeah, it makes sense. I'd love for you leaders of your communities to reach out, and I have a bias for the fire service. I love what it does. I'm passionate for it. I'd love to see you folks try to convince some of your, the massive strength you have in there to join the fire service, to seek to get into the fire service. I think we could use some additional strength in our dimension. That's the first piece. So if you're out there and young men and women, and they're looking at careers, if I could ask and indulge upon you to point out that the work that the fire service does every day for humanity, every day for public service, and every day for vulnerable populations, challenge them to why they wouldn't want to be a part of that, because I think we'd love to have them. The second piece is, I think that a couple of things. There are always going to be times where the response, if you will, from the government or from the fire service, wherever it is going to be challenged, meaning the problem is for at least a period going to be bigger than the solutions being provided. What we typically see is people struggling at that point. The people who are being impacted are struggling. That's a great opportunity for when those people have no one to care, for a place to be open, for the open arms to be welcoming, to bring people in. I think, and as you can imagine, it's very difficult for us in the fire service when we're trying to deal with kind of the fire combat side of eliminating the source problem. we do understand, we get focused on the firefighting because it's the root cause of the impact, but how people are treated in and amongst that crisis actually defines a lot more what the outcome is going to be. I mean, it's never a positive outcome, but you could have, you could have this crisis in your life, but it could be so life-changing in the way that other people treat you and help you as sort of the governmental piece or the fire service is working to eliminate the problem. You don't have to eliminate the problem to be the biggest success piece of that event, meaning caring for people and showing them how they should be cared for, how they can be cared for, minimizing that harm in a more humanitarian way than as a tactile way, as far as thinking that we're ever going to solve these problems by eliminating them so they never happen again. We will constantly be challenged as a race of human beings with all manner of things that threaten us. But it's how we go about the processes of dealing with it and each other that will really define our commitment to the people we share this planet with.
Agreed. And I do have one more question, but before that, just to put it in your mind, I'm going to put you on the spot here. And at the end of your segment, I'm going to ask you to do a 1-minute pitch, and we'll cut that out, put it on TikTok, and we'll get that out to the communities so that they can join the firefighting service. It is one of the goals of this event. So we keep it hip, we keep it down to youth. So if at the end of this, our conversation, I'll just ask you impromptu, and then just 1 minute. So my last question, though, is what lessons learned and best practices can you share for NGOs who want to start supporting this initiative, or who want to work in addressing the effects of climate change, particularly in flood response and firefighting? What would be your suggestions for them?
Well, I think one of the things we always see in BC and across Canada, as soon as there's a tragedy, everybody wants to know what they can do. I think communicating around kind of an all hazards approach to being ready and preparedness, and within your community, and whether it's a faith-based community or a geographical community, whatever it may be, I think in the forefront, spending a little bit of time in how you can get your message out to people that this is a safe place to come. We'll be ready to bring you in and give you some form of shelter. And it doesn't have to be that your organization is caring for them in every way. You're just the facilitator of others. I think that's the greatest thing. There are a lot of people I think basically in every one of our cultures, everybody wants to help when they see tragedy. I think the greatest thing we can do is organize that positive initiative, have a place where people can come together and help each other. You don't have to have all the solutions. You just have to be the gathering place and the facilitator, in my mind.
That's awesome. I really like that, Chris. And I'll give you a suggestion. So for this 1 minute pitch for people to join the firefighting service as a career, speak from the heart. Don't overthink it. We always find that to be the most successful approach. All right.
Will do.
All right, please go ahead. 1 minute. Why should we join the firefighting service?
The fire service is a service that's been built for years in tradition. This is a service that at its foundation is about being there for others in their time of weakness, bringing your strengths of your community, bringing your knowledge and base, adding and working as a team, and caring for those who need your care. It's a very taxing trade. It's a trade with a massive amount of reward to care for others. There's no greater calling than to care for somebody else in your every in your every breath and in your every working hour. You'll never suffer from understanding what your mission is, what the purpose is in your vocation of life. And why not have things, the ethics, the morality that is you, bring those to our service and grow them ever stronger. I would love to see the members of your communities, of our communities across this planet well represented. And I would love for the best, the best and the brightest and the shiniest and the most committed of every community in the fire service. It's selfish. I think we could do great things, but it's funny because in that selfishness is really based on a selfless premise. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. That was perfect way to end it. And I will get that out there. The message is important. That is part of the reason why we're hosting today's event, is to do exactly that. And how you ended it is the perfect segue for our next speaker, because selfless service, forgive me if I'm pronouncing this wrong, but Siwa is one of the most important aspects of the Sikh faith. And Jatinder Singh is the executive director of Khalsa Aid Canada. Sasriyakal, Jatinder. Khalsa Aid is an international NGO with the aim to provide humanitarian aid in disaster areas and civil conflict zones around the world. The organization is based upon the principle of recognizing the whole human race as one. And during the 2021 fire and floods in British Columbia, Khalsa Aid mobilized direct aid for many communities cut off from resources and support and services. And their team of volunteers were on the ground and famously in the air with rented helicopters working to support those affected by those natural disasters. Jatinder, please.
Thank you, Yusuf. It was really nice to meet you when you did come over. And before I start, I'd mention that I am on the traditional territories of the Lekwungen-speaking people, namely the Songhees, the Esquimalt, and Wasanich people. The last year has been extremely busy. We went from heat wave or the heat dome directly into the floods, it felt like. The one thing I realized very quickly was that the gurdwaras here, the Sikh places of worship, they're designed for this type of thing. So we had a lot of food, being prepared and delivered. And a lot of this was on an individual basis. Khalsa Aid, we actually moved a little bit away from the food security after the first week or so and focused more on the communities that were kind of missing. The gaps were there. So for example, the migrant workers, with a lot of farms being flooded, they were either returning home, or if they were able to work, they needed, clothing that could withstand the weather. So that was an area we focused on greatly in providing them with food and clothing for the weather. And then in some cases, providing them with assistance such as accommodation and travel so they could get back to their home countries in cases where the farms were beyond repair. We also notice when we're working in the smaller communities, we do lean personally on the gurdwaras because they have their kitchens and the community is very central to the gurdwara, and so you can lean on them to help you. But what we found was in other areas, such as when we're working with the smaller fire stations, for example, such as Spencer's Bridge or some of the Indigenous ones around Mercer, that they were having issues partly from being cut off, especially in the heat dome, of getting aid. So silly things like, little things like eye drops and things like that. For us, it was a very trying time. I think what happened in a grateful way for us was that we were able to connect with a lot of other groups, were either Sikh-based or non-Sikh-based, and also engaged, especially after the floods, with the province, which we hadn't done before. Because the scale was so large, it was important to engage with EMBC and try to understand what the other NGOs were doing and what we were doing. And obviously, more famously, with all the helicopters that were providing aid, everyone knows about those. And for us, in fact, that's developed into a kind of a partnership with Helicopters Without Borders here in BC. And to this day, we're still providing aid, mostly to Indigenous communities that are cut off by road and need items. So we are grateful for that. One thing, in a kind of more of a positive way, is realizing that we have gurdwaras where we can engage, we've actually started working with them to prepare them, working more at the municipal level. So, for example, in Victoria, we've engaged one of the gurdwaras here, so they can kind of get MOUs in place and sign contracts and have their gurdwaras ready, that if there is an emergency, they've already talked to the municipality, and the municipality come in and set up tents and have them be kind of emergency centers for the community. And I think there's a big willingness among other Gurdwara to do this as well. It's just not always knowing where to go, or even knowing that this is a service that they, for example, could provide. So I think better communication between the faith groups and the province and at the federal level, I think would make for a better response when it comes to these kind of emergencies. So we're already working, and despite it being very wet right now, we're still, we're working towards, the kind of forest fire season, and also working towards, whatever winter brings, so that we're ready much better than we were when it all hit before. And I think those are kind of very important things. There was a big learning curve for us. I mean, right now, not in British Columbia, but we're working, in Ottawa with a lot of the more lower income communities that have been really massively impacted by the storm that went through there and losing power. So it's something, it's funny because maybe about 3-4 years ago, we thought, okay, let's grow CALSA aid a little bit more into the north, where we think there's going to be a quicker, a more immediate need with respect to climate change. But we found it's come all the way down to Vancouver, it's come to Ottawa, and it's come to all the large cities, and even though we were thinking about it, we weren't thinking about it being so quick and coming so quickly to the major cities. And that's something we're going to have to really consider. And I think for the province, it's going to be an investment, I guess, in infrastructure and preparedness all year round, I believe, in being ready for these events.
Agreed, Jatinder. And the work is one of continuous need and urgency. Climate change, unfortunately, is not just up to Canada to deal with. There's many other factors at play, and we're just how we can do the best to mitigate it within our control is, I think, what a lot of us are focusing on. And there's so much still that we need to do before, we even look at others. So like taking that approach, that systemic step-by-step approach, that we need to all work together. We need to look at this from a long-term perspective, and we need to build the capacity to ensure that we can deal with these challenges as a whole of community effort. I think all of those points are absolutely clear, and I thank you for bringing them up because it needs to be said. So thank you for participating and sharing your voice and the amazing work that you guys are doing. I'd like to now introduce our next speaker. Hassan Ghani is the Regional Manager for Islamic Relief Canada. Islamic Relief works with communities around the world to strengthen their resilience to calamities, and they provide vital emergency aid where disaster occurs. The work they've done in BC has been amazing, especially in terms of helping to organize and facilitate delivery of emergency aid to flood reliefs, to the fire reliefs. Hassan himself has gone on the ground to many of these locations. I can attest to that personally. Their efforts in Canada have focused on not only aid, but also youth development, women empowerment, supporting Indigenous communities, building relationships between the Muslim and Indigenous communities, as well as newcomer and refugee support, and these emergency humanitarian responses. Also, Hassan is the person who brought forward the idea of a humanitarian coalition, of how we can speak with one another and connect so we can share our understandings and best practices. And just to be on the same page as organizations doing the nonprofit work to support our communities. So thank you so much, Hassan. I know it's very late where you are. He's in Medina, Saudi Arabia at the moment. So thank you for participating, and we'd love to hear from you.
Awesome. Thank you for having me here tonight or today. Huge shout out to Brother Tariq and the foundation team for having me and the work that you guys do. Again, apologize if I'm a bit slow, if I stutter a bit. It is quite late here, and it's quite hot here. So in regards to what we do, like Yusuf mentioned, and I'm actually happy that I'm going after everyone else, because it really packs, and my point really packs and sums up everyone else's point. You know, us to work together, kind of something about Islamic Relief and about what I do with Islamic Relief, just to get my point across better, in regard to the humanitarian coalition that Yusuf just mentioned. So I've had the opportunity to visit not only in British Columbia in regards to the fires and floods, but as well as our international work. So Islamic Relief has offices in about 40 countries around the world, and kind of similar to Khal's Aid, we are UK. We were founded in the UK, and you know, we operate in a fundraising capacity here in Canada, you know, United States, UK. And we implement quite a bit of our work, you know, in Africa, in the Middle East, and Asian areas of need. Personally, I've been able to visit mostly areas in Pakistan, North Pakistan, and Balochistan. These are areas that have been quite, you know, hit by droughts, especially Balochistan. So Islamic Relief has been able to build micro dams. Actually, organizations like, you know, World Food Program and other humanitarian aid organizations are able to kind of consult from Islamic Relief. Even the government there, the local government of Balochistan, actually refers to Islamic Relief's projects whenever they're, you know, binding something into their mandate. So here on the local level in British Columbia, as Yusuf mentioned, and I've been very familiar with actually all of, you know, from Finesse to, you know, Health Aid, and, you know, the local municipalities that we work with, nothing but helpful and open door policies from the local community, you know, anything from feeding us food, you know, to giving us clean water. It's always a joy working with them. So kind of my point was just bringing everyone together. I'm just going to quickly open up a PowerPoint if I am able to share my screen, hopefully. Share. Just going to put it on slideshow so everyone can see that, correct? Yes. Awesome. So I'm just going to skip a few of these points I've already mentioned. So just our previous work, similar to the other organizations, you know, once the flood happened, we had 18-wheelers roll in from Alberta. Our office in Alberta supported that. A huge thing about us is we really want to invest in mitigation. And that's one of the big topics of today as well, is what is the preparedness behind, you know, tomorrow if there were a disaster. Us as organizations and us as communities, how are we working together in order to, you know, be prepared as much as possible. A big thing about us is also a multi-phased approach. So we don't just look at the next day or two or the next 3 days. We want to look at the next year, 6 months, and 1 month, just kind of boiling it down. What investment opportunities do we have for, you know, municipalities or fellow organizations who need that help, who are able, you know, have that accessibility. Like Finesse is a really good example of that, where they have that direct link with communities they work in, or firefighter organizations are a good example of that, where they are, you know, they represent a specific a job or a duty or role in this response, and it's very important. We've been able to support shelters, provided immediate emergency aid in, you know, the next few days after the disaster, and anything leading up to the next few months in terms of infrastructural support, you know, planting trees. I think the biggest municipality that we've worked with in mitigation and infrastructure is actually the city of Chilliwack. So kind of the main point for today from our side, before I take up too much time. So Islamic Relief is part of this humanitarian coalition. It's, you know, 12 of the leading charities in Canada. Some of these names might be familiar to a lot of you guys. In a nutshell, what we do is we come together whenever there's a major disaster or crisis. You know, for example, the Ukraine crisis that's going on right now. Islamic Relief, a good example for us is when we took a major role in was during the Lebanon blast, the Beirut blast that happened in August of 2020. So Islamic Relief was actually leading the response for that, and the Canadian government was actually funding it. So the biggest, I think, outcome of the humanitarian coalition is where charities, major charities, are able to kind of link up, share data, share their roles and assets, and sit down on a table and really not work in silos. And that's something we've noted in the past, 2 responses, from wildfires in Litton to the floods in the Fraser Valley and interior BC, where there was a lot of repeated effort. There were trucks being turned away. I think this was for the floods. They were going into Chilliwack, and the food banks just couldn't accept that much aid. They didn't have space. So a lot of mitigation on that end is needed, a lot of communication. And this is kind of an opportunity, not only from the government level or the services level, but also from the organizational level, where we should be able to sit down on a table and be like, and have that coordination and be able to communicate, we're going to zone A, city B, whatever it might be, we're providing this aid, this is what we're able to do in whatever our capacity it is, maybe even open the door of collaboration even more. So it's really, the potential is just sky high. You could go anywhere with this thing, and this idea is really purely for collaboration. It isn't meant for one organization to take the lead or a government to take the lead. It's really for collaboration and everyone to play their part and role in. Again, kind of the next steps and action items, at least from our end, and it's, again, take this as an open invitation for everyone in this call. Doesn't matter if you're watching or if you're part of the call. We have been in coordination with the provincial government. Nikki has actually been a part of that. We wanted to kind of go official with it, have that letter open to the public, and cultivate those lines of communication with fellow organizations, and formally propose that collaboration, and take it from there, at least before the next disaster, because we know it's around the corner, unfortunately, and it's just up to us how prepared we could be, and again, where we want to take this thing. So if you have any questions, feel free to contact me, and thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Hassan. Again, a beautiful intention and heartfelt work. What we'll do is, in the email we send out tonight, we'll include that so that anyone who wishes to would be able to, we can help facilitate that coordination, as it is one of the outcomes that we're hoping to forward on today's call, is that better understanding and cooperation with one another in addressing these shared community challenges. Just before we go to the next segment of today's event, I'd like to give an opportunity to my dear friend Norm Leach to maybe say a few words with us. Again, the importance of understanding where we are, we have to remember how we got here. And for folks who have been taking care of this place for 10,000 years, more or less, it's always important to hear about the experiences, particularly in terms of understanding and appreciating the unique geographic realities of our land here. Norm is the executive director of the Vancouver Aboriginal Community Policing Center since May 2016. He is from the Tiitamek Nation community, which basically surrounds Lillooet. And he has the Vancouver Aboriginal Community Policing Service is a nonprofit society that doesn't just do policing. Their main focus is on addressing social justice issues, improving safety, building cooperation, facilitation, and partnerships in order to help Aboriginal communities, but others as well. So thank you so much, Norm. I'll let you say maybe a few words as well.
Thank you, Yosef. And hello, Tarek as well. I apologize for being late. Amazing topic, and again, an amazing group of people you've been able to gather together to discuss it. Did you want me to still do a land acknowledgement?
Absolutely. I think it's not just at the beginning. It is something that's always important. And I think formalizing things too much sometimes detracts from the actual meaning. It might actually make people think a bit more that we took it out of order a little. So
Okay.
please.
So the way I do it tends to illustrate the relationship that Indigenous people have with the land. So I always acknowledge the land itself first, because the land was here first. It has provided everything. Every cell and molecule and atoms of our body came from the land. And the land is actually a relative of ours. We think of her as that way. She's our oldest, she's our greatest grandmother. And having provided everything without question, without limit, without condition, without interruption, everything we've ever eaten or drank or medicines or shelter we've ever used, she's provided. And to do that in such a way forever is essentially the definition of love. So Indigenous people have that relationship with the land, knowing that the land loves us and has provided us so much more than we can ever begin to repay. And so having thanked the land, we acknowledge the people who've taken care of these lands. And where I'm sitting in actually Burnaby, it's been the Musqueam and the Squamish and the Tsleil-Waututh people who've cared for these lands in such a good way for 10,000 years at least, that it was actually better than new when the explorers arrived, because the people understood that it was their responsibility to leave it as good as or better than it was provided. And they have. And so in acknowledgement and gratitude for the many gifts that they've received from the land and the universe, they've done a good job so that we can sit here in a circle and discuss these important topics in a good way in order to help each other and the people and the land itself as best we can. So I don't know if you wanted me to discuss your topic at all, or.
Well, I completely open, Norm. I think one of the topics I think that would be beneficial, especially from your perspective, is that relationship aspect. So a lot of our conversation today is on how to better take care of the climate and the environment, but maybe you might want to speak to the why.
Well, it's the relationship. We don't see the land as property. The land is a relative, so we owe a duty of responsibility to our ancestor. We don't have the right to destroy or pollute or alter it in much of a significant way, except to improve it. So we understand that it's part of a balance that we have with the land. And in exchange for the gifts that we have, it's the greatest gift in the universe to be born human on Earth. There is no better planet, and there's no better being to be than human. And in exchange for that, we're supposed to take care of it. We get intellect, we get dexterity, we get mobility, we get judgment, we get imagination, we get this planet, this weather, these people, these foods, all these environments. Wow. And we get it for a little bit of time. This little bit of time we each get. And we're supposed to take care of it. And that's our understanding of what it means to be a good human being. And we did that for 15,000 years. And we understood the balance and we maintained the balance. And that's the gift that we have of judgment, to see and to understand and to see imbalance and to try to restore balance. And so we did. And if anyone had ever asked us, and when they arrived here, can you show us how to live here in a good way? We would have told them, yeah, absolutely, we'll teach you. But hardly anyone ever asked. So we've tried these colonized ways for, well, in BC, 300 years now. We've tried and we've tried and we've tried. And as far as we can see, the ways we had, the ways that worked for 15,000 years, worked better. Now the trees are all gone. The salmon are all gone. The buffalo are all gone. And there's not nearly as much clean water as there used to be. And now it's getting hotter. More floods, more fires, and more people getting sick. So good that you're having this conversation. We would love to be part of the conversation, and also to talk about what we still remember before colonization. And our communities still remember, because we are some of the most recently colonized people on the planet. So if people want to have that conversation and ask, how did people live here for thousands of years in a good, healthy, sustainable way for so long? We'll tell them.
Thank you, Norm. And our keynote speaker today is actually hopefully going to be able to carry on the conversation that you brought up, because we recognize that. And as communities really trying to bring into the center how to change this. And once you mentioned not using the colonized ways to solve colonial problems. So later in a bit, Brendan Mercer from Finesse is going to be, which is the First Nations Emergency Services Society, will be speaking to these issues and what they've learned and what's worked very, very successfully. So thank you, Norm, for joining. Much appreciated, my friend. I'm just going to take a brief moment and speak to some of the work that the BC Muslim Association has done to support communities here in British Columbia over the last year. So Tarek and I are former executives with the BC Muslim Association. And during our tenure there, we helped to facilitate and coordinate with other Muslim charities and NGOs to assist in fundraising for communities, including the people of Litton and the Litton First Nations, in rebuilding and securing immediate aid and shelter. Together, I think we raised about $35,000, which we were able to support the community. Later on, in response to the historic flooding our province faced, we were the BC Muslim Association, which, by the way, is the province's largest Muslim group. There's 19 mosques, 22 satellite locations, 2 schools, providing cradle to the grave services for approximately 100,000 Muslim settlers in British Columbia. And the work that we've done has been primarily in facilitating the relationship between NGOs doing on-the-ground work, the Muslim community, and the ability to support through advancing awareness, education, and fundraising to support the communities who are either suffering because of climate change, or those organizations that are supporting them directly. This year, we're launching more programs to provide additional support systems, including food support, as well as social services, to look into ways to provide more meaningful and tangible impact as community members here in the province of British Columbia. With the floods, for instance, we raised about $35,000, which we were honored to be able to support Finesse with, because of the culturally sensitive emergency support they're providing and the revolutionary, I guess from a colonist perspective, ways that they're doing their work to help protect the environment and ensure that future generations will be able to benefit from that. That's a little bit about the work of the BC Muslim Association. I think it was important to mention because a lot of the community, they do their work quietly, and they don't like to a lot of the times maybe have people know about it. But we saw such amazing, passionate people that we just wanted to highlight some of the roles of those folks. Our next speaker also comes from a faith background. Jet Tekoka is, excuse me, Jet Tekoka is with the Mennonite Central Committee. He's worked in fund development with faith-based organizations that alleviate extreme poverty around the world for 22 years. He's currently the advanced director of the Mennonite Central Committee, British Columbia. So MCC is a faith-based organization which expresses God's love for all by meeting the basic human needs for uprooted and vulnerable people. They work in 45 countries as well as here in Canada. Jet, thank you so much for joining us today. We're very honored to have you.
so much, Yusuf. It's a privilege to be here, and I must say, quite humbling to be in such a gathering of people doing such great work. So, salam, shalom, sat shri akal, peace to all who are gathered here. We want to have a good conversation in a good way. And thank you for that introduction, Yusuf. I just want to read just a couple sentences from a document that MCC has published, our principles and practices. And actually, you heard Yusuf say some of the words, but Mennonite Central Committee, shorthand is MCC, a worldwide ministry of Anabaptist churches. That would be one expression of the Christian faith. We share God's love and compassion for all by responding to basic human needs and working for peace and justice. MCC envisions communities worldwide in right relationship with God, each other, and creation. So even in that statement, I find so much basis for hope and optimism that we can come together around these important things. And I think if there's a ray of hope and good news in all of us, in all of this, so many of us coming from our respective cultures, faith traditions, backgrounds, realize that there's so much more now that unites us, even if it's of necessity, than should be keeping us apart at this time. As far as MCC and our response in recent months, MCC is headquartered in Abbotsford, which I would acknowledge is situated on the traditional and unceded territories of the Stolo peoples, and specifically the Samath and Musqueam First Nations. They are our neighbors, they are great friends to us, and have been so gracious in accepting our presence there in Abbotsford and up and down the Fraser Valley. Following the wildfires last summer, we were able to provide some relief, food, hot plates, toasters, basic utensils for families that had evacuated from Litton and up and down the canyon, and some had arrived at Shway Village in the east end of the Fraser Valley. So we were able to provide some support that way. And then, like several have expressed on this call, much of our response has been very, very grassroots, very spontaneous and organic. And as Chris mentioned earlier, we found ourselves acting in the role of facilitator. And really, MCC, our mandate from our constituent churches really is more international. MCC is tasked with responding to international incidents, things like the Haiti earthquake, things like the tsunami of 2004, 2005. And we have a sister organization here at home called Mennonite Disaster Service. And so we found ourselves working very closely with MDS. MDS is largely a volunteer organization, and that's especially true here in BC and in the Fraser Valley. And put quite simply, they found themselves facing a capacity issue. So a great many of our constituents were responding. They were responding financially. We were able to receive the donations, which in the end totaled just over, I think, $400,000. And we were able to support MDS, Mennonite Disaster Service, working in both Princeton, where there was a great deal of damage, and I would say less resource brought to bear, and then also in the Fraser Valley. And it was some of our constituent churches became, I would say, community hubs. So this would include Yarrow United Mennonite Church, Yarrow Mennonite Brethren Church in the sort of on the eastern edge of Sumas Lake, and the eastern part of where some of the floodwaters had come. And then also on the other side in Arnold to the west, there's Arnold Community Church. And in each of those situations, those churches became like community centers. So for instance, almost overnight, Arnold Community Church, which has quite a large parking lot, became a transfer station. So people began, as houses were mucked out and wet drywall, wet insulation and so forth, and debris and waste was taken away. It was brought to the parking lot of Arnold Community Church, which became the transfer station. And then that just became a rallying point for groups of volunteers who were helping homes to clean up and muck out. and indeed even some rebuilding. In fact, I believe it's next week, one of the final homes we're going to help rebuilding. We actually have assembled a team of volunteers to go and paint, to put the finishing touches on one of the houses that's being essentially rebuilt, rehabilitated. I believe the total between Princeton and Yarrow and Arnold is somewhere on the order of 50 homes. So these would be families who didn't have access to other resources that we identified or had some relationship with, that we've been able to help them get their homes back into livable conditions. So we're just very pleased to have even a small part in that. We don't take a lot of credit for ourselves. We just became, again, as Chief Chris said, we became sort of facilitators. Beyond all that work, though, MCC, we wanted to, to put it in Christian terminologies, if I may, we talk about creation care. And, I think we have something to share in that regard. We know we have much to learn, especially from our Indigenous neighbors. But even as we speak, MCC is undertaking amongst our supporters and donors and constituents an advocacy campaign called For the Love of Creation. We also, just as Rabbi Brugman expressed early on the call, somewhere we went astray. We fell prey to greed, and I guess we got confused. The earth was not here given us to exploit. It was ours to steward. And maybe we're learning these lessons a bit late, but we're trying to provide education, theological reflection, advocacy initiatives, and action amongst our donors, supporters, and constituents. Each of our projects now worldwide has a sustainability component, and indeed our activities here at home in fundraising, we have a sustainability piece embedded in one of our 5 strategic initiatives. We're now measuring our carbon footprint. We now evaluate very careful when and if we will travel, for what purpose, what will be the not just economic, but the ecological cost of travel. And we're trying to model what we should have been doing all along. And we acknowledge that now, and we look for the best way forward. And we would want very much to be part of conversations and discussions about how we can operate and serve together across ethnic and faith traditions and communities. Together, we know we can be much, much stronger. So thanks so much for having us. It's a privilege, and I'm humbled to be here today.
Thank you, Jet. Again, what you were saying, it touches to what we're trying to convey, the importance of working with one another, especially because these challenges affect all of us. So many times the silos that we live in as communities prevent us from understanding not only how our actions historically impact others or what's currently impacting others, but also what other people are doing that we could benefit from. So by breaking down these silos, you probably heard before, but Tarek and I, our favorite term for ourselves is silo busters, and then bringing communities together. So not just breaking things, but also fixing them, bringing communities together to work on these shared challenges. Today is World Environment Day. As Norm was saying, the earth is part of the conversation. It's a living thing. It's something we have to have a conscious understanding about. And as you were saying, from a faith perspective, from the Christian perspective, the highest ideals of that tradition would reflect that. So thank you for acknowledging that and working together on moving forward together. Our next speaker is going to be discussing very interesting things that have been happening in British Columbia, which is really taking a recentering of traditional Indigenous approaches to land management, as well as community development to heart, and the success over many decades, and finally the acknowledgement of that success at a national and international level. Brendan Mercer is the Information and Technology Manager for the First Nations Emergency Services Society, or FNES. FNES evolved from the Society of Native Indian Firefighters of BC which was established in 1986. Their mission was to assist First Nations in developing and sustaining safer and healthier communities by providing them with programs and services. Finesse pioneered Fire Smart, which is a national initiative to help property owners and communities understand the ways in which wildfires might threaten their homes and structures, such as those located to forests or grassy areas. The Fire Smart Homeowners Manual, which is a tangible resource and outcome that should be in every home, provides owners and communities with simple steps to reduce the susceptibility of buildings and properties to fire. It's available for download from the FireSmart Canada and BC Wildfire websites, and we'll include it in the email that we send out tonight to everyone. Brendan, thank you so much for joining us today. We're very honored to have you as our keynote speaker.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much for the wonderful introduction, Yusuf. And I'll just pull up my slideshow that I prepared as well. So yeah, thank you so much for having me at this multicultural awareness event and as part of World Environment Day, obviously. Thank you so much for getting the opportunity to speak and kind of share some of what I experienced last year working with First Nations, some of the impacts that happened to their community with the worst wildfire season and some of the worst flooding ever on record, how we're trying to integrate Indigenous science with Western science to come up with better practices moving forward, looking at all hazard risk assessments, and how we can work together in collaboration to get a lot more work done across the province than we're typically doing right now in BC. So just as a quick example, this is all the First Nations communities in a blue dot in British Columbia. There's 204 unique communities that we work with. Each one has their own unique risk profile. Some are on the coast, obviously at more earthquake, other communities are in the interior. So it makes it so that we have to come up with unique solutions to work with each nation to help reduce the risk all across the province. So some of the things that have happened over history that have led to some of the things that we're seeing now is one case, 80 years of fire suppression. And this has happened for multiple reasons. One, because they put the fire suppression teams in. Historically, First Nations weren't even legally reserved to do things like traditional burning. So now that some of those laws are changing, we're hoping to get back to a place where we finesse can help nations do more burning. And this is what the result is. Essentially, if you don't have wildfire on the landscape, a lot of these drier ecosystems grow a lot more trees. When you have a lot more trees, you get a lot more intense wildfire. Historically, former Kuki Ron Ignace from Skeetchison used to talk about how his grandfather would tactically burn certain areas, specifically to enrich the fruits, the berries of that area, so that wild game would come back and they could have a better, more biodiverse forest for things like moose, deer, bighorn sheep, porcupines, blue grouse. All types of animals, need different types of habitat, and this really dense forest is hard to work with for some species. What that looks like on a landscape level is here around Ackham First Nation. So pay close attention to the forested landscape, and this is Ackham, just north of Cranbrook, BC, in about 1950. And you can see how over that time change, there's a lot more trees on the landscape now. So at a landscape level, it shows there's thousands of hectares that we're having this issue with provincially. Of course, there are big changes like the airport and the golf course here, but the key is changed over that simple time span. As a result of those forests being so dense, we get these huge wildfires. So you can see here, these big wildfire scars in red and the blue First Nations communities adjacent to that. This is just the southern third of the province from last season. These fires alone in this picture with 386,000 hectares. That's a huge amount of area. Provincially, there's about 860,000 hectares that burned last summer alone, making it, again, one of the craziest wildfire years. Prior to that, there was a heat wave like none other that we've seen in BC, impacting some of the nations. So talking to people on the ground in Litton, they said it was 52 degrees Celsius that day before the big Litton Creek wildfire took off. Also, records kind of show that there's about 8% humidity. Typically, when you have a temperature and a humidity switch where the temperature gets above and the humidity gets way below the temperature, when I was back on the fire crews working for BC Wildfire years ago, they would literally call you over the radio and say, you're about to have a crossover, expect crazy fire conditions that day. So when you get 52 degrees Celsius and 8% humidity, it's dry like nothing we've ever seen before in this province. And therefore we have fires that spread faster, more rapidly than we've ever seen before. This is imagery that we take from satellites and pull it into our data management tool every day. And it just looks at available moisture. So this is that same area around Litton, around Nikamin, and some of the other nations that are in the same area, like Shaka and Nuayach. But the red areas just go to show how little moisture there was available in the vegetation. This was just slightly after the fire, a couple weeks into the fire, but still a good example of how just dry it was. When you have those conditions, again, it leads to these massive wildfires. So you see here, the Litton Creek wildfire, one of the biggest ones last year, the one that destroyed the town of Litton and Litton First Nation, was 54 kilometers east to west, 32 kilometers north to south. These are huge, huge areas. So just for reference, these orange polygons on the screen are First Nations reserves. And the big colorful polygon in the middle is the burn severity. So the important takeaway there is those red areas had a really high burn severity, essentially wiping out all the vegetation and damaging the soils for years to come afterwards. This is an example of what that looks like around Nikamin First Nation. So you see on the top of the hill, this is where that rank 6 wildfire impacted, essentially wiping out all the trees and destroying all the vegetation. Essentially, when that happens, you can destroy soil aggregates, which take decades to reform after a wildfire, as well as destroying entire rooting systems and wrecking the ecosystem for wildlife. But at the bottom of the hill, that's where we worked with Nikamin over the last decade to do fire smart treatments around the community. You see the intensity is a lot lower there because we go in ahead of time and reduce the extra vegetation, the extra trees that have been growing because of fire suppression. In a lot of these ecosystems, especially in drier British Columbia, if you have fewer big trees per hectare, you actually have a way healthier ecosystem because it reduces the fire risk as well as increasing carbon storage and sequestration potential. So by doing a lot of this work around Nikamin, we reduced the risk dramatically as that wildfire went across the top and ended up protecting all the structures in the community as a result of those treatments. To give you an idea of what that looked like prior to treatments, this is what Nikamin essentially looked like. What you see in the bottom of the screen is ranked 7, 8, 9, and 10 wildfire risk around the community. Using those data tools, we're able to find where the riskiest areas are around the community, design treatments, and put them in place ahead of time in order to figure out where the best places are going to be to protect the community. In this case, Nikamin has 463 hectares of fuel treatment to do. The way things work currently is that would take a long time for any one community to treat 463 hectares, especially when you consider things like fire return intervals. A lot of the ecosystems in the interior part of BC burn once every 30 to 40 years. Historically, that's just how often the fires return to the landscape. So in order to be successful, you have to basically treat 463 hectares every year, which is why it takes a really concerted collaboration effort among multi-agencies to come up with solutions to do this work. In the case of Nikamin, they actually were able to treat over 100 hectares, but it took them 12 years to do so. They weren't able to treat that whole bubble that we've seen on the last screen, which is unfortunate, because even though we protected the structures, the fire was still so intense in the landscape that we had those big rank 6 areas that were just above the community. Here's an example of pulling in satellite level information every day to see exactly where the hot spots were. So this is just a window from July 16th to July 22nd, but we can kind of see how the wildfire moved through the community, where it impacted, where it didn't. And again, some of those treatments near to the bottom of the community seem to have some benefit in reducing that wildfire intensity. So my takeaways from last summer were, look, these treatments actually make quite a difference around communities. If we were to do a lot more of these type of treatments, maybe we wouldn't have had that big rank 6 wildfire up on the hill behind Nikamin. And of course, we protected all the structures, which is fantastic and worthy of giving ourselves a pat on the back. But by not doing enough of these treatments across the landscape, we come across issues like this, where this is in one of those rank 6 patches near Nikamin, and we can clearly see that the vegetation is all dead. And what is on the ground there in the forefront of the picture is water running over the top of the soils. So in a previous slide, I said when you have those rank 6 wildfires, you destroy soil aggregates. It makes soils essentially afraid of water, so water can't actually absorb into the ecosystem anymore. When we have these huge wildfires that are 54 kilometers east to west and 32 north to south, with tens of thousands of hectares of high severity burn. We get this across the landscape all over the place, where water now runs across the soil, eroding a lot more and degrading the ecosystems more as we get more rainfall. So as an example, this is Nikamin, the entrance to the community prior to the flooding event we had in the fall. Everything looks great, but right after that flooding event, all that extra sediment that came down off the hill, all that extra water that couldn't be absorbed into the ecosystem anymore, now comes down through this one channel and causes a tremendous amount of erosion on the far bank. In this case, there's over 120 feet of erosion, but dealing with other communities throughout the flooding and fire events of the summer, we learned that New Ayach had over 300 feet of bank erosion, 100 meters just in one single night. So it just goes to show that you can have an unbelievable amount of more water coming down by having these ecosystems not able to readily absorb. Another picture from the same area shows that bridge that was in the background also having a support being washed out. As a result of these type of events, Nikamin had to be evacuated 3 times last summer because of wildfires and flooding. These are all recovery costs of the province, EMBC, Finesse, and we work together obviously to get donations and use our funding to support nations. But it's a lot of these recovery costs adds up that get borne onto the taxpayers at the end of the day. So collectively, we have to come up with better solutions to address these ahead of time so that we don't have these impacts to the landscape. Further, as a lot of this extra soil and sediment gets washed out to sea, this is an example from working with Pennacook tribe on Vancouver Island. As all this extra material and sediment gets washed out into things like estuaries, which clogs up and prevents them from harvesting clams and traditional foods in those estuaries as they would have done historically. So there's all kinds of impacts that last for years and decades after wildfire that are sometimes borne by taxpayers, First Nations, poor minority communities often bear the brunt of these impacts because they rely on the land in a disproportionate way. To put it in perspective, I always use a quote from the Catholic Nation elder, Millie Mitchell, put it this way: First Nation people used to go out to get their own clothing in the mountains by gathering bark, roots, mosses. All the clothing right down to your feet was hunted or gathered for. And that's just puts it in perspective how much some First Nation people rely on the land base to provide these ecosystems, goods and services for foods, for medicine plants. So by having these massive wildfires, we're wrecking all these other things downstream that in some cases take decades to fix afterwards. As a result, we have to work collaboratively with everybody to get resources to communities. And these pictures just kind of highlight some of those other recovery costs that you don't hear about. Everybody hears about suppression costs, which we'll get to in a minute. But here we have our strike teams out there working with communities to bring bales of hay to horses, working with other groups to provide food to communities, bring in fresh salad, fresh ingredients, also using helicopters to try to get residents access to their properties that are totally cut off and still cut off because the highway infrastructure hasn't been fixed to some of these reserves. Those costs are tremendous and they add up significantly. Here's an example of that. From 2003 to 2017, BC spent $3 billion on wildfire suppression. $3 billion. In that same time span, we spent $73 million on wildfire prevention. Those are those treatments that you've seen around Nikamin there that saved the community. We only spent $73 million. That is a fraction of the wildfire suppression costs. In that time span, that $73 million, we got 11,678 hectares of fuel treatment done provincially. That is equal to 0.01% of the 2017 wildfires alone. That just goes to show that the scope and scale of the mitigations that we're doing provincially are not working. We have to be doing a lot more prescribed and cultural burning along the landscape, and we need to be working with governments and other groups to find the resources and the people to be able to get out there on the landscape and do these type of jobs, because restoring ecosystem health is critical for everybody, not just First Nations. But what's really interesting is you take those wildfire suppression costs, and Headwaters Economics has done some fantastic economic estimates around the true recovery costs after wildfire. So you see that at the bottom of the screen. At a minimum, they estimate 20 times suppression cost is the average recovery cost. that number could be 20 to 30 times more expensive. Taking the low end figure, in British Columbia, we've spent almost $62 billion on recovery in that 15-year time span. Those costs are borne by me as a taxpayer, by you folks as taxpayers for this community, and everybody that relies on ecosystem goods and services. Collectively, we have to do a better job of managing ecosystems, promoting nations and people to get good working opportunities to get out there and do this type of work. Lastly, just this last year alone, we spent $565 million on wildfire. Using the same Headwaters economic statistics, it could be up to $17 billion just in recovery costs for this last season alone. And again, these costs don't get picked up anywhere and are quite often borne by communities that have to fix water infrastructure and have to deal with cascading impacts like siltation and all this extra erosion coming downstream. In some cases, for decades, they'll have these issues that they have to deal with. And that comes out of tax bases, out of people's pockets at the end of the day, because then communities don't have other avenues to put money into social services or to other things that matter in communities. So as a quick example of why we need to do things better, I hate to show graphs on a slideshow, but this one's super important because this talks about that study that I just mentioned. On the left side graph, you have those red bars at the top. That is what happens when you have wildfires in forests that have not had fuel treatments. You have way more CO2 that gets released. Those blue lines are when fires happen in treated forests. You have way less CO2 that gets released when you do these treatments. Also, if you do proper prescribed fire and promote big, healthy trees on the landscape, less overall trees, but bigger, healthier individual trees, you can actually store more carbon and sequester more carbon over a 100-year time span. And that's what the graph on the right shows. By doing thinning and burning, that if it gets impacted by a wildfire, these top two blue lines essentially indicates that over a 100-year time span, you're going to store more carbon in the ecosystem than you would have historically. This is a big deal right now because in British Columbia, they say that our forests are actually carbon emitters instead of carbon sinks, like they would have been historically when nations were burning for tens of thousands of years. But now if we get back to that, hopefully we can start to reverse the trends and get our forests back into being a carbon sink and slowing down the impacts of climate change to our communities. As an example of what we need to do is revitalize traditional burning. So here's an example of doing that exact work around Hoiston First Nation and some of the key species that thrive from wildfire in the Kamloops-Teshwetmik territory, which I'm calling in from here today. But we see these all the time where Ponderosa Pines, these kind of trees have serotinous cones that actually open up when heat hits the cone. So the cone opens up and then puts seeds out. Little intense fires are really good, or little fires are really good for the ecosystem. They're just bad when they get really high intensity and cause that type of ecosystem destruction. But a lot of things like pine grass and yarrow, some of these species really benefit off a light prescribed burn, and will actually then start bringing ungulates, deer, grouse, things like that back into the ecosystems around communities, making them much healthier and much more resilient going forward. Here's a picture from one of our First Nations ADAPT projects where we are actually putting prescribed fire back on the landscape in the name of climate change, because a lot of these mitigation treatments impact climate change as well. By reducing the excess sagebrush fuels that you see here, it could prevent a fire from being way more intense down the road at the end of the day. All kinds of other things, I mean, as well as just putting prescribed fire in the landscape, it's really good for improved mental and physical health for nations, because a lot of people can see cultural burning to enhance well-being and empowers people, gives them strength of identity and ability to foster important relationships with members of the communities. And then by reestablishing that over the couple of years later, you can start to see some of these traditional foods coming up back into the ecosystem and really understanding why these type of burning things are so valuable to communities. So what we see going forward is basically integrating technology to make things a lot easier in the field. So you see here is kind of using drones to get us really high definition imagery that we can then put back into our tablets, share with the nation, share with our field crews. Going back to Hassan's presentation earlier, he mentioned how important it is going to be to share data in the future. And that's exactly what Finesse is trying to do, is try to establish these connections with other agencies to share and leverage resources. In this case, this was drone imagery taking around Nisconolith. The left side is one of those fire smart treatments. You see it, less trees overall, but those trees are more resilient and will sequester more carbon over time than the trees on the right. If the fire happened on the right, you'd get a way higher intensity than you would on the left right now. So that's why doing work like this is so critical, because you can get that extra wood out of there ahead of time and make a big difference on the ground. So this is just a quick video highlighting what a treatment sort of looked like and the benefits of integrating data and analytics into the decisions that we make. So this is just showing a forested stand down around Lillooet First Nation before a fuel treatment would happen. So as you can see, lots and lots of trees in the forested stand. And then in a moment, it'll do the fuel treatment. You'll see a lot less trees in the forested stand. But the idea is that with good data and good information and sharing resources amongst agencies, one group can produce really good models like this and then share them with everybody else to do carbon modeling, to do climate change, pollution. You know, there's so many different avenues that can be taken by integrating data in a more meaningful way. And this, I like to use this because it's a very visual example. This is what a fuel treatment looks like. But you can see now a lot less trees in the understory, so that you could start to then put prescribed fire back on the landscape, because now you don't have all those little trees, all that extra fuel going forward. By taking that data and information, like you just seen with the stand model there for the fuel treatments, we can put it into a database, and then you can see all the different polygons on the map. Right there, it shows you fire treatments, it shows you water sources, deer habitat, archaeological sites. All those different colored dots are meant to represent a different interest or a different value on the landscape. And by working collectively with First Nations, with faith groups, with all the government agencies and nonprofits out there, we can identify all the different land uses and values out there, put them on a map in a strategic way, and share the key information with the agencies that do the work to protect the infrastructure and things that we value on the landscape. So this is how we see data sharing and partnerships looking in the future, is by using interactive tools like this that I'm demonstrating here to share that stuff back and forth, so that you can simply just click on a piece of information and then to learn more about it. So that's how we kind of see the future going, managing all essentially 4 pillars of emergency management by integrating these data tools to bring Indigenous science and Western science a little bit closer together, so that we can have the best results at the end of the day, and hopefully save millions, if not billions of dollars on long-term recovery, because again, those costs impact us now, our future children, and our children's children down the road. So thank you so much for letting me speak and share some of my experiences last summer and during the fall from working with the nations across BC.
Thank you, Brendan. We've always been super impressed with the evidence-based approach that combines science and technology with Indigenous sciences and technology for building these kind of products. You know, one of the things that Tarek and I were incredibly impressed by is when we went with Finesse to Boothroyd, and the detail with which the explanation on the ground, like telling us in specific terms, this is how you fix this problem, this is how you address this problem, like that's a fire risk here, this is what we should do here. Like that kind of experience is limitless. And the fire preparedness kit that you guys have prepared as well, we're going to include that in the email that we send out to everyone today, as well as promote it on our social media network, because you know, you were even saying that there was recognition nationally or internationally for the work that Finesse has been doing, and I think that recognition is so deserved. So one of the things that we wanted to thank you for is that continuation of the work on the ground. And I think many people think that maybe Finesse only works with First Nations, but it's not necessarily 100% true, because the information that you guys are developing is for everyone. That successful model helps all communities. And I think that sharing of resources and information is at the heart of what we're trying to achieve here today. Upkar Singh Tatlia is the Executive Director of Engaged Communities Canada Society, as well as being our closing speaker today. Upkar, thank you so much for your patience. I know we went way overboard in times, but as you see, the passion from everyone here. but we'll make it all look really nice in the final version. So please, if you
And I could personally, Brendan, it's so great to hear from you and your knowledge, and I wish we could go on, but I take comfort in knowing that hopefully this entire collective, we'll all be collaborating soon. And I think that's really the intention here, is that, we come together as co-conspirators and work together for solutions. So I know I'm inspired by everybody today. Norm, I'm so glad that you had a chance to speak as well. So I'm here as more of a fan than anything. So it's so great to hear from everyone. I'm going to go back to what Chief Bocock says, and it's Chief because I used to be a former firefighter and first responder as well. We hear about the pressures of the changing climate, including flooding, the smoke, the challenges on health because of smoke and wildfire, and how those pose significant risk to communities in general, and expected to increase as well. I know in my own hometown of Merritt, BC, that was the case. What's really important for us, especially at Engaged Communities, is we work with marginalized communities, those that are most impacted, those that are often unseen and unheard, even in the response to a crisis. These communities tend to be on the front lines when it comes to these impacts, because they don't get the respite from it that we do. We're able to kind of oscillate in and out of air-conditioned cars, vehicles, homes, and things like that. But when I say marginalized communities, these are often communities that are underhoused, at risk, and have many challenges. So in my own hometown of Merritt, BC, I know that a lot of the rural populations, underserved communities, First Nations communities on reserves, the wildfires were bearing down the most directly on those communities. And we know that the wildland human interfaces, those intervals are shortening as well. So these things are just continuing to compound. This past week, on Thursday, actually, we had a meeting with our regional and provincial partners and representatives from Shiem and Seabird Island to strategize our preparations for upcoming heat response in the urban areas. And as last year we were caught off guard, we don't want to have that happen again. So we're looking at our resources and looking at those communities that I just mentioned that tend to go overlooked oftentimes. So, we're venturing down this new path, this collective response that we're sharing in today. But it's absolutely imperative that we do consider the most marginalized communities, and we'll continue to serve them. And I'm bolstered by knowing that everyone here today too is committed to finding solutions and delivering programming. I think what we've all witnessed here today is perhaps the surety that we will come to solutions, and we can take confidence in knowing that, because after all, we're here on Sunday together to discuss this, and perhaps coming together and contending with the crisis that's imposed on us by the shifting climate as firefighters, first responders, community agencies, as government. We can put forward a holistic response and enact some changes that will lead to a safer province and, in fact, a safer planet for everybody. So on my behalf and on behalf of the organizers as well, thank you once again for your earnest participation today, and definitely look forward to engaging with everyone in the near future.
So thank you so much for sharing that and spending your time with us. I know it was an overly long call, but again, everyone, thank you for spending World Environment Day with us, and we hope to achieve the outcomes of this mission together as one community here in British Columbia. Upkar, Tarek, Jatinder, Norm, Brendan, thank you for staying the whole time, guys. Much appreciated. If anyone has anything or final words to end the call today, please feel free to do so.
I'd just say, Cook Shem, thank you so much for having us, for having me to be able to speak, and I very much look forward to the collaborations and partnerships that we'll inevitably have to have in the future just due to climate change and emergency management.
Thank you so much, guys. All right, everyone, take care now. Have a beautiful day. Bye-bye.